Chapter 1. The Island Where Nothing is Forgotten. The North Sea greeted Jayden not with the cry of seagulls or a fresh wind, as he had hoped, but with a thick gray silence. The boat he had been on rocked on the waves, as if rejected by this water. The captain, an old man with a sunken face and a hand tightly clutching a thermos, had not said a word since they had sailed away from the coast. Only once, pointing his finger at the outline of the island, he said in a muffled voice, "There's a lighthouse. Better not go there at night." The island was tiny, almost flat, with rare rusty buildings that looked more like remains than houses. It smelled of the sea and iron, but under this aroma there was a damp, stale smell, like an old chest that had not been opened for too long. He had arrived as a journalist, on assignment from the city editorial office, which usually sent him to write about new buildings and Green Fridays. But in his hands was a letter, and signed on gray paper with a single line, "It's still burning. Check the lighthouse." The editor thought it was eccentric, but Jayden felt there was something behind it. Perhaps it was this feeling that made him leave the city, friends, noise, and coffee shops to come to an island about which there was not a word on the internet. No articles, no photos, as if it existed only in legends or on maps from the time of sailing ships. The first night, he settled into the only house that the locals rented to him low, with peeling walls and shelves filled with cans of fish. Light barely made its way through a cloudy window. Everything around seemed faded, like an old postcard that someone had kept in a wallet for too long. But it was already midnight when Jayden woke up. Through the glass he saw in the distance, on the edge of the cliffs, where the cliff began, a lighthouse flared up. Its light was not warm, not yellow, it was pale silver, like a knife blade in the moonlight, and it did not blink as it should have. It burned steadily, continuously, point blank, as if looking straight at him. The next morning he tried to ask the locals. First, in a bread shop, the woman behind the counter pretended not to understand English. Then in a fisherman's shed, a man in a knitted hat simply turned away, without even answering. When he reached an old man sitting by a broken boat, he only said, "The lighthouse is not for us. It is for those who have forgotten, or who have been forgotten," and he turned away, taking the silence with him. On the third day, Jayden found his way to the lighthouse. The path was overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to hide the way. Here and there, iron nails stuck out between the bushes, the remains of a fence. As he approached the lighthouse, he felt the air change. It became denser, quieter. Even the seagulls that usually screamed over the rocks had disappeared. The lighthouse was tall, white, weathered. At its foot was an old door, peeling, but not locked. On it hung a sign, almost erased by the rain, on which he could barely make out the word, "Come back." He did not come back. He went inside. Chapter 2. The Smell of Salt and Forgotten Dreams. As the door slammed shut behind him, Jayden froze. It was dark inside the lighthouse, even though the sun was rising outside. Dampness clung to him like a blanket long forgotten in a basement, and the air smelled not just of moisture, but of time. Not of a specific year, but of its very essence. Old age, moldy memories, the things that are forgotten on purpose. The walls of the lighthouse were covered with plaques, like a museum, only without the captions. Rectangles of wood with words burned into them, some of them erased. "He knew. No longer shines. I don't remember." Some were scratched with a fingernail, others were written in ink that had dried decades ago. One in particular struck him. "Nothing dies here, it just stays." As he climbed the spiral staircase, he felt the old boards creak under his every step, as if the lighthouse were sighing in response to his presence. At every turn, he caught himself turning his head, as if someone was following him. But there was only silence, so thick that you could drown in it. On the second floor was a room with windows filled with sea salt. In the corner was a table and chair, and, strangely enough, a fresh cup of tea. The steam had stopped, but the mark on the wood was still warm. Jayden couldn't explain why, but he wasn't afraid. Felt like he was being expected here. He walked over to the table. On it lay a notebook, leather, embossed with wind and waves. Opening it, he saw lines written in neat, familiar handwriting. Too familiar. It was his own handwriting. The entries began with dates he couldn't remember. 2005, 2011, 2014. The lines spoke of coming to an island, of a lighthouse, of how memory only came back here. One paragraph was circled. Every time I forget who I am, but the light brings me back. Only here do I remember what I loved, what I lost. The lighthouse doesn't burn for the sea, it burns for me. Jayden felt dizzy. He leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling, as if there might be an explanation. But instead he heard a sound, a light tapping, like someone running barefoot on the floor above. When he reached the very top, he found himself in a light room. The lens, huge, old, with a crack along the edge, reflected the sunlight. There, on the floor, was a photograph. He picked it up. It was of himself, young, with a woman whose face he couldn't remember. But his heart was beating so hard, as if it remembered better than his head. On the back of the photo was the caption, "You promise to come back, every time." He closed his eyes, and fragments flashed in his head. How he held someone's hand on the shore, how he laughed in the pouring rain, how he shouted into the darkness, "I will find my way back." But nothing whole, just fragments. Fragments that the lighthouse apparently collected for him. On the way back down, he realized one thing. The lighthouse remembered him better than he did. He had been here, more than once. He was coming back. But why? He stepped outside in the middle of the day. The sun was in his eyes, and for a moment he felt dizzy. When he turned around, the lighthouse was still the same, but it seemed to be looking at him. And in that look there was sadness and patience. Chapter 3. Stones That Remember. The next day, Jayden woke up early, although he didn't remember how he got to bed. Dawn was breaking through the hotel window pane as water with milk dissolved in it. Outside the window, a quiet island, as detached as the day before. Below the window, the local postman was walking. He raised his head, nodded, the face familiar, but nameless. Jayden dressed slowly, as if he was afraid to see again something that could not be explained. On the table next to the laptop lay a photograph. The same one with the woman on the shore. He did not put it there, but there was no use arguing with that. He walked to the lighthouse. It was difficult to walk along the rocky path. The wind from the sea tore the scarf off his shoulders. His fingers were freezing, although winter had not yet arrived. Along the way, he noticed stones strangely shaped, smooth, as if someone had sharpened them over time. One of them resembled the silhouette of a heart. He picked it up, and when the stone was in his hand, something inside it trembled. On its surface were scratched the words, "For A." He squeezed the stone, as if it could tell who it was. A woman stood by the lighthouse. An elderly woman, in a dark coat and a gray headscarf. Her face was thin, like an old map, and just as full of secret signs. She was silent, just looking at Jayden. Not like a stranger, more like a mother looking at a son she hasn't seen in a long time. "Did I know you?" he asked before he realized it wasn't a question. The woman didn't answer. She came closer, extended her hand, but did not touch. She only said, "The light is turned off not for those who leave. It's for those who forget." And she left, leaving behind a faint scent of lavender and smoke. He wanted to call her, but his tongue seemed stuck to the roof of his mouth. She disappeared behind the trees, like a shadow, without a sound, without a trace. He entered the lighthouse again. Now the stairs seemed shorter, the walls narrower, the air thicker. Everything seemed to shrink, adjusting to his breathing. Upstairs, in the light room, he found another note. The handwriting was still the same, his, "If you read this, it means you have come again. You are returning because the lighthouse calls you. Not the place, not the stones, not the story, her." He sat down on the floor, leaned against the glass wall, and closed his eyes. Images flashed in the darkness. It was raining, and she, the one whose face was still blurred, was crying at the pier. He held her by the shoulders, saying, "I will return. I promise. In the distance, the lighthouse blinked once, as if nodding. Then a flash, a scream, a boat in the waves, hitting a rock. Silence. When he opened his eyes, it was already dark outside. The lighthouse was silent. It did not shine. For the first time in a long time, there was no light. Jayden stood up. He looked at the note again, and then turned the page. There was one single word on it: goodbye. He went down. The stairs were longer than before. The walls breathed in unison with him. At the exit, he saw her standing in the distance on the shore. Young. The one from the photograph. Her face was now clear, and her smile not sad, but bright. But when he took a step towards her, she dissolved into the air, leaving only the smell of salt and stone warming up in the sun. Chapter 4. The Light That Remained. The island woke silently. No sound, no movement, just the shimmer of morning over a gray sea. Jayden walked along the damp path, feeling the ground spring under his feet, as if it wasn't sure if it was real. The lighthouse behind him no longer gave any sign of life. Without the light, it seemed like a tower from the past, dull, closed, hurt at being forgotten. He had that smooth stone with the inscription in his pocket again. For A. He played it over and over in his head. Why did he know this place by touch, even though he couldn't remember how he got here in the first place? Why was his own handwriting waiting for him inside the lighthouse? He headed toward the old dock, covered in moss and salt. The water in the bay was dark, almost black, like the ink in which the words had drowned. There, on the boards, he saw another stone. Right in the center, white, with faded letters, "You left." His chest tightened. He dropped to his knees, ran his fingers over the broken letters, uneven, as if written in despair. And it all came flooding back. There had been a storm. They wanted to sail away. She, the girl with the camera, with the voice like the whisper of the wind. Aurelia. He had promised that he would find her after he returned to the mainland. That everything would happen later. Only later did not happen. The ship capsized the same evening he reached the shore. He survived. She was left, alone on the island, without a lighthouse, without light, and he forgot. Not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't help but forget. Because all that was left of her was pain. He left, leaving behind an emptiness, and his brain closed the page as if it had never been. But memory is not paper. Permeates the air, the paths, the walls, the smells, and one day it brings you back to where you were meant to be until the end. He stood up and walked down the road to the lighthouse. The silent houses glided past, the windows like eyes watching his return. The lighthouse was already open. The door was slightly open, like lips about to say goodbye. He walked in. On the steps was a strip of her camera. On the wall was an old photograph of them. And next to it was another stone, this time with his name, Jayden. He picked it up and whispered, "I remember." And then the light came on upstairs. Faint at first, like a smoldering memory, and then brighter. The tower was breathing again. The lighthouse was coming to life. He went outside and looked out to sea, and he saw among the foam of the waves, on the edge of the horizon, a silhouette, a girl, standing barefoot on the water, looking at him, smiling. The light from the lighthouse is reflected in her eyes. He doesn't know what it is, a vision, a spirit, a memory. But he knows the main thing: she has forgiven. And the light will remain.